You know, I still replay that moment in my head sometimes, and every single time, I get the same chill down my spine. It's not often you witness a moment of such absolute, bone-deep silence, especially in a room full of people who, just seconds before, were practically screaming at you. But trust me, when the lawyer finished that sentence, it was like the air itself had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind this heavy, suffocating vacuum. My Aunt Carol, the self-appointed matriarch, looked like someone had just slapped her across the face with a frozen fish. The smug, victorious smirk she had been wearing just a heartbeat before completely dissolved, leaving behind a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. My cousins, who had been echoing her cruel, dismissive remarks, froze mid-nicker. Honestly, the only sound I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart in my chest, and maybe, just maybe, the subtle, almost imperceptible thump as the fragile, carefully constructed world of entitlement they had built for themselves finally, irrevocably crashed down. Tell me honestly, after everything they put me through, was I wrong for feeling that glorious, intoxicating rush of vindication wash over me? Would you have savored that silence just as much as I did? Because what happened in the lead up to that moment, what my so-called family did to me, well, that's the real story here. This whole horrible saga really starts a little over a year ago, when my grandmother, Elinor, passed away. She was the absolute center of my life, my safe harbor, the one person in my entire extended family who saw me, truly saw me, and loved me unconditionally. My parents died in a car accident when I was only 10, and while my Aunt Carol technically became my guardian, it was Grandma Elinor who raised me, who taught me how to bake, how to read, and most importantly, how to stand up for myself. Aunt Carol, on the other hand, well, she was a piece of work. She was my father's older sister, a woman whose entire self-worth was tied up in appearances and wealth. She was perpetually critical, always pointing out my flaws, my lack of breeding, and comparing me unfavorably to her 3 perfectly manicured and equally unpleasant children, my cousins Sarah, David, and Jessica. They weren't bad kids, I guess, but they were products of their mother, entitled and deeply sheltered, taught to believe that everything my grandmother owned, which was quite a lot, thanks to a very successful textile business my grandfather had started, was rightfully theirs. Grandma Elinor's home, a sprawling, gorgeous Victorian house on a massive piece of land overlooking the river, was the main point of contention, the crown jewel in their imagined inheritance. But beyond the house, there were the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, the valuable antiques, and the original artwork. My grandmother had always been very private about her finances, a fact that drove Aunt Carol absolutely mad. All Carol knew was that there was a substantial estate, and she intended to be the primary beneficiary, and by extension, her children. She constantly dropped hints, made demands, and generally made Grandma's final years a lot harder than they needed to be, all while putting on a performance for the rest of the world that she was the dutiful, loving daughter. I, meanwhile, was just the quiet, bookish granddaughter, the one who didn't fit in with their polished world. I went to a state university, not their Ivy League schools. I worked as a librarian, not in finance or law. I was, in their eyes, insignificant, a charity case. The best thing they thought I could do was just disappear quietly after Grandma was gone. But for all their money and perceived sophistication, they completely missed the most important detail, the profound, unbreakable bond I shared with my grandmother. I was the one who was there every single day after her cancer diagnosis. I moved in with her, managed her medications, drove her to her appointments, and simply held her hand when the pain was too much. Aunt Carol would stop by once a week for exactly 1 hour, usually just long enough to tell Grandma how disappointed she was that her will wasn't already sorted out, because, as she'd loudly declare, "It's not fair to keep us waiting, Mother, we need to plan." She never offered to help with the grueling physical care, never sat quietly with her, never offered a genuine word of comfort. It was always about the will, the money, the house. When Grandma finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, I was heartbroken, absolutely gutted. But alongside the grief, I felt a responsibility to honor her memory, which meant holding her funeral exactly as she had wished, a small, intimate affair. Aunt Carol, of course, tried to turn it into a massive spectacle, a networking event for her social circle. We clashed immediately, and that was the beginning of the end of any pretense of civility. Over the next few weeks, as I was still reeling from the loss, Aunt Carol moved quickly, like a vulture circling a carcass. She changed the locks on the main house, claiming she needed to secure the estate, until probate was settled. I was still living there, technically, but she just locked me out of the main areas and told me I could stay in the small, separate guest cottage until arrangements could be made. She didn't even give me time to properly pack up all of my grandmother's personal effects, insisting they be left for the appraisal. It was humiliating and incredibly cruel, but I was so worn down by grief, I didn't have the energy to fight her. Then came the meeting, the one that the lawyer, Mr. Harrison, finally called. It wasn't the official reading of the will, apparently, but a pre-probate informational session. Aunt Carol informed me about the meeting, not with a proper invitation, but with a curt 3-word text message, "Meeting tomorrow." I didn't understand the message at first, so I called her, and she explained in her most condescending, icy tone that I was not needed. "We already divided everything, dear," she announced, the words dripping with satisfaction. It was a very simple, straightforward matter, honestly. The house and the bulk of the assets are split evenly between the children, as Mother always intended. You weren't invited for a reason. You're not family, not really. You'll get a small, non-monetary inheritance, Grandma's old jewelry box, maybe a few pieces of sentimental junk. The lawyer will mail you the details later. Now stop bothering me. I have actual business to attend to." She hung up before I could even process the sheer audacity of her statement. Divided everything, without even a proper will reading. It was baffling and incredibly insulting. I couldn't just let that lie. Not because of the money, truly, but because of the disrespect to my grandmother's memory and the transparent avarice of my aunt and cousins. I knew how meticulous Grandma was, how she planned everything. She would never have let Carol just railroad the process. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called Mr. Harrison's office directly. I didn't tell him what my aunt had said. I just asked him, very calmly, if I needed to attend the session tomorrow. He hesitated for a long moment, a pause that spoke volumes, and then said, "Ms. Miller, I highly, highly recommend your presence. The meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp." That was all I needed to hear. The slight tremor in his voice, the emphasis on highly recommend. It confirmed that something was definitely amiss. I decided right then and there I would show up, uninvited and unwelcome, but present. The next morning, I arrived at Mr. Harrison's prestigious law firm, feeling sick to my stomach, but determined. I walked into the conference room, and it was exactly as Aunt Carol had described, only with a much more dramatic backdrop. The room was huge, with dark mahogany paneling and a long, imposing table. Aunt Carol was sitting at the head, dressed in an expensive, dark suit, flanked by my 3 cousins, all of them looking smug and self-important. When I walked in, carrying nothing but my small handbag, the air turned instantly toxic. Aunt Carol's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "What in God's name are you doing here?" she hissed, pushing her chair back slightly. "I told you you were not invited. This is private family business." Cousin Sarah piped up with a sneer. "Yeah, this isn't for charity cases, Anya. Take a hint." David just rolled his eyes and went back to scrolling on his phone. I walked directly to the empty chair at the far end of the table and pulled it out deliberately, slowly. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the polished wood. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," I said, completely ignoring my aunt and cousins. "Thank you for letting me know about this meeting." I turned my gaze back to Aunt Carol, meeting her fiery eyes with a level, calm stare. "I am here because my grandmother was my legal guardian, and I was living in her home until 2 weeks ago. I am here to understand the disposition of the estate." The next 20 minutes were a blur of condescension and outright dismissal. Aunt Carol took center stage, speaking over Mr. Harrison, who was clearly uncomfortable. She dictated what she believed the will said. So, as I explained, she said, gesturing grandly, "Mother decided on a very clean split. The river house, which is the most valuable asset, goes to Sarah and Jessica. The rest of the properties and all the liquid investments are divided between David and myself. It's all very straightforward. We've already gone through the main house. We're going to be putting some of the smaller pieces of furniture in storage next week, and the antiques are going to auction. We're really just here to finalize the transfer paperwork." She looked at Mr. Harrison and then directly at me, a sharp, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "We already divided everything," she announced, the words ringing with finality. "You weren't invited for a reason." It was her moment of victory, her chance to rub my face in the dirt. I felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. I looked over at Mr. Harrison. He was pinching the bridge of his nose, his face a road map of frustration. He had tried several times to interrupt, but Carol's voice was simply louder and more insistent. I decided to give him an opening. "Mr. Harrison," I interjected, speaking softly but firmly, with all due respect to my aunt. "I believe the only person who can explain the division of the assets is you, the executor, after the official will reading. Is this not a pre-probate meeting? Could you please clarify the contents of my grandmother's final testament for everyone present?" Mr. Harrison looked from me to Aunt Carol, who was practically vibrating with indignation. He took a deep, steadying breath, shuffled the papers in front of him, and finally spoke. "Mrs. Miller," he said, addressing Carol, "I understand that your recollection of your discussions with your mother are important to you, but they do not supersede the legal document." He paused again, a long, dramatic silence that seemed to irritate Carol even further. In the interest of efficiency and to conclude this session, I will simply read the relevant section of the will, which I must remind you was executed just 3 months before Mrs. Eleanor Miller's passing, making it the most recent and only valid legal document. He put on his reading glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read a section about the general bequests, small amounts to charities, etc. And then he got to the main body of the estate. The room was completely silent, except for the slight rustle of paper. He started reading the key paragraphs, the ones concerning the primary assets, the house, the business shares, and the liquid accounts. He read them slowly, clearly, and meticulously. So that was the situation I was in. They had mocked me, excluded me, and tried to steal the memory of my grandmother by pretending her will didn't exist or was irrelevant. They tried to claim a substantial inheritance that they had done absolutely nothing to deserve, while I, the person who had dedicated the last year of my life to my grandmother's care, was told to accept a paltry jewelry box and then just vanish. I had to decide, do I let them bully me out of the room, accept the meager scraps they offered, and allow them to distort my grandmother's final wishes? Or do I stand my ground, assert my right to be there, and demand the truth be read out loud, regardless of how uncomfortable it made them? Before I tell you exactly what Mr. Harrison read next, and how my whole life changed in that instant, I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have left after Aunt Carol told you to? Or would you have waited for the lawyer to finish, even if you were terrified of what came next? Let me know your gut reaction, and then come back, because you won't believe what he said next. Mr. Harrison finished the section on the smaller bequests, and then moved his attention to the largest section, the disposition of the main assets, the part Aunt Carol was so sure belonged to her and her children. His voice was steady and professional. Paragraph 7, Section A. The primary residence located at address known as the River House, including all adjacent and contiguous land parcels, shall be bequeathed in its entirety to Rose Miller, the granddaughter of the deceased, for her sole use and benefit. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was nothing compared to what came next. Aunt Carol let out a short, sharp, choked sound. She slammed her hand down on the table. "What? That's impossible. You must be reading the wrong section. Read the part where it says my daughter Carol, Mr." Harrison held up a hand, silencing her with a look of stern professionalism. He continued, unflustered. Section B. All stocks, bonds, investment portfolios, and liquid cash assets, including accounts at bank names, shall be placed into a trust, with the entirety of the proceeds and principal to be distributed to Anya Rose Miller, the granddaughter of the deceased, upon final settlement of the estate, to be managed by the executor until that time. Now, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that screams. Cousin Sarah's jaw was practically on the floor. David was no longer looking at his phone. Jessica had a hand clamped over her mouth. Aunt Carol looked like she was about to have a stroke. She was sputtering, red-faced, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is a forgery, a lie. Mother would never do this. She would never cut her own daughter out. She hated her. She barely tolerated her." She was absolutely screaming now, completely losing control, the polished veneer cracking and shattering. Mr. Harrison, bless his soul, waited patiently for the outburst to subside, and then he delivered the final, devastating blow, the one that made the room go truly, deadly silent. He looked directly at Aunt Carol, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "Mrs. Miller, I assure you, this is the legal will. And as for your assertion that your daughter is the beneficiary, I regret to inform you that is incorrect. While your mother did make some minor, specific bequests to you and your children, the vast majority of the estate, including the house and the business, is directed towards Ms. Anya Miller. In fact," he paused, letting the severity of his next words sink in, "but her name is the only one in the will that is listed as the primary, residual beneficiary for the significant assets." That was it. The final truth. My grandmother hadn't just given me the house. She had designated me as the sole primary beneficiary of the entire significant estate, including the textile business shares, effectively making me the owner and controlling partner. The small, minor bequests to Carol and the cousins were exactly that. Small, specific sums of money, maybe enough for a nice car, but nowhere near the millions they had expected. They hadn't been cut out entirely, but they had been knocked off the pedestal they had built for themselves. The silence in the room wasn't just shock. It was the sound of 4 people realizing their years of entitled expectation, their arrogance, and their blatant cruelty had just cost them everything. Aunt Carol, finally finding her voice, lunged across the table toward me, but Mr. Harrison's paralegal immediately and calmly placed himself between us. "This is not over, you little gold digger," she shrieked, her voice hoarse with fury. "I'm contesting this. I'll tie this up in court for the next 10 years. I finally spoke, my voice surprisingly steady and clear, cutting through the chaos. "Aunt Carol," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "you told me yesterday that you had already divided everything and that I was not invited for a reason. The lawyer just proved the reason you didn't invite me was because you already knew the will's contents, or at least suspected them, and you wanted to cut me out before I could find out the truth. That is called attempted fraud, and I believe Mr. Harrison has witnessed your actions." I looked at the lawyer, who nodded grimly. "I will not be contesting a thing. I will, however, be pressing the lawyer to finalize the probate as quickly as possible, and the first thing I will do when the estate is settled is sell the River House. I will be liquidating the business shares. I will be removing every single thing that reminds me of how you treated me and my grandmother, and I will be putting the money towards a future where I never have to see any of you again. The look on her face when she realized she would not only not inherit the house she coveted, but that I would sell it out from under her was priceless. The aftermath was exactly as predicted. Aunt Carol did try to contest the will. She hired a flashy lawyer who quickly realized the will was ironclad, perfectly legal, and had been signed, witnessed, and notarized just months before Grandma's death. Grandma Eleanor, in her infinite wisdom, had prepared for exactly this. There was a detailed explanation, attached as a codicil, explaining that she felt Anya was the only person who had ever shown her genuine love and care, and that she felt her daughter and grandchildren were too focused on the monetary value of the estate to be trusted with its preservation or control. She specifically thanked me for being there for her when she needed it most. It was devastating for them to hear, and a powerful validation for me. The contesting failed. I had to endure months of their hateful phone calls and emails, but Mr. Harrison shielded me as best he could. I followed through on my promise. As soon as the estate was finalized, I sold the river house. I didn't need a huge, empty mansion, and the thought of them driving by and seeing someone else living there was a final, quiet victory. I sold the business shares, which gave me a comfortable, life-changing amount of money, securing my financial freedom forever. I didn't go on a spending spree. I stayed in my small apartment, kept my library job, and lived quietly, knowing I had a massive safety net. The money was a blessing, but the real gift was my grandmother's faith in me, her final, loving act of justice. Aunt Carol and my cousins, who had counted their chickens before they hatched, had their lives completely upended by the shock and the financial disappointment. They were forced to sell their own smaller homes to cover legal fees and the lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. They became the social pariahs they had always accused me of being. I learned a powerful lesson that day. Never let entitled people dictate your worth. Always stand up for yourself, even when you are shaking with fear, and trust that a life lived with honesty and love will always, eventually, win out over greed. My grandmother was a genius, a truly incredible woman, and her will was the ultimate mic drop. So that's my story. It's hard to believe it all happened, but every day when I look at the small, personal items my grandmother left me, the actual beautiful jewelry box, not the junk my aunt promised, I remember that incredible moment of absolute silence. It was the moment I finally got the justice I deserved. Like this video if you were on my side and agree that my grandmother did the right thing. Subscribe for more stories like this, where the quiet one finally wins. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. I'll see you all in the next story.